The American economic crisis stemmed from a widening wealth gap created by policies and power structures. As asset values soared and wages stagnated, prosperity concentrated in the upper class. The theory of wealth inequality posits that debt, inflation, and institutional design silently held back the remaining 90% of the population, maintaining market stability while hindering social mobility. Watch the full video for a deeper understanding of this issue. The Wealth Gap Doctrine: Prosperity without shared mobility. The camera glides over a sea of suburban rooftops, uniform and silent, before tilting up to the shimmering, jagged glass of the financial district. We begin with a question of physics. How can a system grow larger while the space for those at the bottom grows smaller? This is the opening act of the Wealth Gap Doctrine, a systemic reality where prosperity is no longer a shared tide, but a fortified island. For the top 1%, the last decade has been a golden era of asset inflation and unprecedented liquidity, fueled by a global architecture that rewards the ownership of capital over the exertion of labor. But for the bottom 90%, the walls are closing in. We are witnessing the birth of a neo-feudal economy, where the ladder of social mobility has been replaced by a glass ceiling reinforced by debt and rising costs. This documentary explores the invisible mechanisms, the interest rate pivots, the real estate monopolies, and the policy choices that have engineered this divide. As the middle class hollows out and the working poor find their labor increasingly devalued, we must confront a chilling truth. The gap is not a malfunction of the system. It is the doctrine of the system itself. The finish line for financial security isn't just moving. For most, it is being erased entirely. Productivity without pay, anatomy of the affordability crisis. The signs of this doctrine in action are visible in the fundamental decoupling of productivity from wages, a trend that began in the 1,970 seconds and has accelerated into a permanent state of crisis. We see it in the affordability gap, where the price of essential assets like real estate and education has increased by hundreds of percentage points, while inflation-adjusted wages for the bottom 90% have largely stagnated. Economic indicators reveal a disturbing concentration of liquidity. While the broad money supply has expanded, its velocity has plummeted in the hands of the working class, sequestered instead in high-end equity markets and offshore vehicles. In cities across the country, the proliferation of luxury housing alongside a growing homelessness crisis serves as a physical manifestation of this wealth divergence. Credit default swaps for consumer debt are rising, signaling that the lower tiers of the economy are stretched to their breaking point. This is the stage where the economy stops behaving like a marketplace and begins to resemble an extraction engine. For the average person, the sign of the doctrine is the disappearing surplus. The reality that even with multiple jobs, the ability to save or build equity is being systematically devoured by the rising floor of basic survival costs, leaving a vast majority of the population perpetually one paycheck away from insolvency. How crises transfer wealth from labor to capital. The mechanisms of economic shocks in a wealth gap economy are designed to protect capital while liquidating labor. When a crisis hits, the shock is transmitted through the debt instruments held by the bottom 90%. As interest rates rise to combat inflation, the cost of servicing credit cards, student loans, and adjustable rate mortgages skyrockets, acting as a massive wealth transfer from households to the financial sector. This is the squeeze. Unlike the top 1% who possess the liquidity to buy distressed assets during a downturn, the bottom 90% are forced to sell, often at the bottom of the market. This mechanism of forced liquidation is a primary driver of wealth concentration. We see this in the aftermath of every major bubble. The wealthy emerge with larger portfolios of real estate and stocks, while the working class loses their homes and retirement savings. The exchange rate of labor for life is devalued, and the liquidity trap ensures that new capital injected by central banks flows directly into asset bubbles rather than the productive economy. This architectural flaw ensures that every economic shock acts as a ratchet, tightening the grip of the doctrine and making the gap increasingly difficult to bridge. As the cost of entry into the asset-owning class moves further out of reach with every cycle. Global warnings. Wealth gap leads to societal hollowing. Global case studies offer a roadmap for where the wealth gap doctrine leads. In the 1997 IMF crisis, we saw how structural adjustment programs in Asia protected international creditors, while forcing local workers into decades of austerity. Argentina serves as a haunting example of middle-class erasure, where repeated currency devaluations and sovereign defaults stripped away the savings of the professional class, leaving a society bifurcated into a small elite and a massive, impoverished underclass. Greece's debt crisis illustrated the sovereign squeeze, where public assets, ports, utilities, and land were sold off to private foreign interests to satisfy debt obligations, effectively turning the nation's productivity into a permanent rent stream for external owners. In Turkey and Venezuela, we see how hyperinflation acts as the ultimate wealth gap tool, vaporizing the purchasing power of the wage earner, while the elite, who hold their wealth in foreign exchange or hard assets, remain untouched. These cases prove that when a system prioritizes the rights of capital over the survival of the citizen, the result is always a hollowed-out society. These nations are not developing toward a Western model. Rather, the West is increasingly adopting the third world model of extreme stratification, where a thin layer of extreme wealth floats atop a sea of systemic precariousness, America's two-tier recovery and the financialized dream. In the United States, the wealth gap doctrine has manifested as a two-tier recovery. Since the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent pandemic shocks, the top 10% have seen their net worth explode due to the skyrocketing values of real estate and the stock market. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% hold a negligible share of the nation's total wealth, often possessing more debt than assets. This impact on the US economy is a loss of social elasticity. When a majority of the population is buried under student debt and high housing costs, they cannot take risks, start businesses, or move for better opportunities. The American dream has been financialized. It is no longer about production, but about positioning within the debt cycle. We see this in the rentierification of the economy, where large corporations buy up thousands of single-family homes, transforming potential homeowners into permanent tenants. The impact on a person's life is a constant, low-grade anxiety, the feeling that you are a stranger in your own country, paying for the right to exist on land you will never own. This structural divide is reinforced by a tax code that favors capital gains over earned income, ensuring that those who work for their money pay more than those whose money works for them, a fundamental tenet of the doctrine that keeps the bottom 90% firmly at bay. How policy protects assets while widening inequality. Government and central bank responses have historically acted as the underwriters of the wealth gap. In every major crisis, the primary tool of the Federal Reserve has been quantitative easing, which involves buying financial assets to lower interest rates and boost liquidity. While this prevents a systemic bank collapse, its primary side effect is a massive boost in asset prices, which benefits only those who already own assets. This is trickle-up economics. By the time this liquidity reaches the real economy in the form of wages, it has already been outpaced by the inflation it helped create. Government fiscal policy often follows suit, offering bailouts and subsidies to too-big-to-fail institutions, while offering only temporary, meager relief to the working class. This creates a moral hazard, where the wealthy are shielded from the consequences of their risks, while the poor are told to embrace the efficiency of the market. When inflation finally bites, the response is to raise interest rates, which disproportionately hurts the debtor class and suppresses wage growth. This institutional bias is the doctrine in practice, a set of policies that prioritize market stability and asset values above the purchasing power and standard of living of the bottom 90%. The result is a system that is stable for the investor, but volatile and extractive for everyone else. Economic self-defense strategies in a wealth gap system. Survival within the wealth gap doctrine requires a radical shift toward economic defense. When the system is designed to extract, the first step is to minimize your surface area for extraction. This means aggressively reducing high-interest debt and lowering your cost of survival to maximize liquidity. In an era of asset inflation, the traditional advice to save money is a losing strategy because currency loses value faster than it earns interest. Instead, individuals must seek fractional ownership or micro-investing in hard assets whenever possible. Financial literacy is no longer an option. It is a survival skill. Useful insight for the viewer. You must understand the difference between nominal and real value. If your wages go up by 5%, but your rent and food go up by 10%, you have been taxed by the doctrine. Survival also involves human capital diversification, developing skills that are portable and resistant to automation. On a community level, building parallel economies such as barter networks, credit unions, and local food cooperatives can provide a buffer against the volatility of the global financial system. The goal is to move from being a passive consumer of the debt system to being an active architect of your own resilience. True autonomy in a wealth gap world is found in the ability to say no to the debt cycle and to build a life that is not entirely dependent on the permission of a landlord or a bank. Wealth gap doctrine. Policy choice, not natural law. The closing message of this documentary is that the wealth gap doctrine is not a law of nature, but a choice of policy. The extreme concentration of wealth we see today is the result of decades of decisions that prioritized the short-term gains of the few over the long-term health of the many. But a society with a hollow middle is a society without a future. History shows that when the gap becomes too wide, the system loses its legitimacy, leading to either radical reform or social collapse. The lesson for the viewer is that the bottom 90% are actually the primary engine of the economy. Without your labor and your consumption, the towers of the financial district would be empty. Reclaiming the economy begins with a shift in consciousness, recognizing that the doctrine relies on your belief that you are alone in your struggle. By demanding a return to fair play, progressive taxation, and the protection of the commons, we can begin to tilt the scales back. The future does not have to be a neo-feudal dystopia. It can be a world where productivity is rewarded, where assets are accessible, and where the wealth gap is a relic of a primitive era of greed. The doc team only works if you remain at bay. Once you understand the architecture of your own exclusion, you possess the power to demand its dismantling. The sun sets on the era of extraction. Let it rise on an era of shared prosperity and genuine economic dignity. Wealth gap psychology, narrative enforces inequality, undermines commons. At the psychology of the gap, we find that the doctrine is maintained as much by narrative as it is by math. The bottom 90% are often fed a diet of aspirational individualism. The idea that they are just temporarily embarrassed millionaires who should support policies that favor the rich. This creates a survivor bias that prevents collective action. The impact on a person's life is the erosion of social capital, the loss of parks, libraries, and public schools as funding is diverted to service debt or provide corporate incentives. This is the privatization of everything, where your access to a quality life is determined entirely by your ability to pay. The insight for the viewer is that wealth is not just about the numbers in your bank account. It is about the quality of the commons you share. When the gap widens, everyone, even the wealthy, eventually pays the price in the form of higher security costs, social instability, and a stagnant culture. To bridge the gap, we must reinvest in the things we own together. The doctrine tries to convince you that you are a consumer first and a citizen second. Reversing that priority is the first step toward reclaiming a stake in the nation's future. The doctrine is fragile because it depends on your compliance. It is time to choose a new path based on the value of every human life, not just the value of every share. Restoring the social contract. Collective power against wealth extraction. We conclude the Wealth Gap Doctrine with a vision of a restored social contract. We've seen how the architecture of collapse is built on the extraction of value from the many to the few, and how the interest trap, the inflation tax, and the pension ghost are all parts of a single, unified system of control. But the architecture of resilience is within our reach. It starts with economic transparency, the clear understanding of who owns what and how much they are paying for the privilege. It continues with democratized finance, where the tools of wealth creation are accessible to all, not just a gated elite. The remarkable closing message is one of collective power. Throughout history, every major advancement in human welfare, the weekend, the 8-hour day, public education, was won by people who realized that the doctrine of their time was not inevitable. We are at a similar turning point. The wealth gap is a signal that the old way of doing things is over. Your role is to be the catalyst for the new. By educating yourself, organizing your community, and voting for a productive rather than an extractive economy, you are the architect of a new world. The gap is wide, but it is not infinite. On the other side is a society that values work, respects the worker, and ensures that the bottom 90% are not just kept at bay, but are the very foundation upon which a lasting and just prosperity is built.